So welcome to the UK's Human Landscape Lesson 2. Today we're looking at the UK's population, thinking about who we are. So, getting on with today's lesson means that you're going to need this video and your PowerPoint, which you should have access to, and a copy of your worksheet. Now, I'm just going to quickly show you what that looks like so that you feel really confident, okay? So your PowerPoint looks like this, and we're going to go through that in just a moment. Your worksheet looks like this. Now, it might look like there's a lot of writing on there already, but this is basically every single task we ask you to do throughout the lesson, including the videos we're asking you to watch. So, starting task, defining these two key terms, please. Then you're gonna watch this video, then you're gonna mark your homework, and you're gonna do these questions based on what we've discussed, so on and so forth, okay? So you write in here. Up here at the top, it will say your name and then L2 UK population worksheet, okay? So it is your copy of the work, nobody else's. We're looking at who we are, and we're going to be looking at the population characteristics of the UK and thinking about how they've changed over time to understand the process of migration. Before we get started, can you please define both internal or national migration and international migration? What do you think the differences are? What even may be some of the reasons that people migrate? Write the definitions on your worksheet, please. Does anybody think they know why we get these patterns of internal migration? Where do many migrants in the UK live? Why might they choose to live in those places? Okay, where do many migrants come from? We did an entire investigation about this last year in year 9. Okay, where do many migrants in the UK come from, and what might be some of the causes of that? Okay, if you do history or sociology, these are questions that you will have answered in those subjects too. So some answers then. Internal migration is when people migrate within the same country or region. For example, moving to London, moving from London, from Plymouth, or moving to London from somewhere else in the country. I commute every day from one part of London to Wembley, but that does not mean that I have internally migrated, okay? Because I'm doing it on a daily basis rather than moving to live and work, it is not migration, it is commuting. Okay. However, if I left London and I went to university in Leeds or Edinburgh, those would be me migrating, okay? I would be migrating because I'm moving for most of my life, okay? Most of the purpose of my life to live, work, study in another place in the same country. International migration is when people migrate from one country to another, for example, from moving Spain to the UK, as many of our wonderful NHS workers have done, or moving from further afield to the UK, or even, if we wanted to talk about emigration, people who leave the UK to go and live and work in other places in the world. So, this was your homework, okay? You had it either over the Easter break or you had it yesterday, okay, at the end of the lesson, but it's definitely on your Google Classrooms. You have a digital copy, and you should hopefully have a paper copy of this as well. And the homework task was to annotate this population pyramid. Before you do this, before you check your answers, it would be really helpful if you watch this YouTube video up here, okay? Now, the YouTube video is about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to interrupt my video with that, but I would like you to watch that video, please. Then we're going to do the annotations, and I'm just going to skip through those because I want you guys to do them by yourselves, please. And we're going to look at the causes of the UK's population growth. So, a couple of reasons then why the UK's population has grown. But there are two sort of big categories. The first is natural increase. The fact that there are more people being born in the UK than are dying overall, okay? Now, perhaps in our current somewhat unprecedented circumstances, the UK's population may in fact shrink over the coming year as many people die, and perhaps potentially the number of people dying outstrips the number of people being born. But on as a general trend, the birth rate in the UK tends to be higher than the death rate, which means that the population is growing. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this would be the case. Many women in their 20s are having children earlier, okay? So over the last sort of 50 years, the trend has been to have children later, but we're starting to see the trend to come slightly back down again, people not pushing having children to so late in their lives. Now, this is not a complete trend. Okay, we don't know if this is going to be maintained, and certainly with the science, say for instance around things like IVF, okay, and fertility treatments, people can have children later, and also many women are choosing not to have children until after they've finished studying, say for instance going to university or securing their jobs. Okay, so women in their 20s having children earlier. Also, on that same topic of having better science to be able to have children later in life, many older women who previously postponed or delayed having children are now having their children. Okay, and then finally, an increase in the number of women born overseas. So 27% of the births in England and Wales for 2014 were to mothers who were born outside of the UK. And this is a really interesting point. The UK's population growth rate would not be positive, i.e. we would not have a growing population, we would have a shrinking population without migration. As we've already said, the birth rate is dependent on migrant women, women who are born elsewhere in the world and who have come to the UK, okay? But in addition to that, many other people move, whether it's young people, students, workers, young men, young women. All of those people are able to move to the UK through a variety of means, whether it's through the European Union's freedom of movement or through gaining visas for specialist work, okay? And some of this is because London is what's considered a world city. It's a really attractive place to live and work. And we have world-class industries in many things. We have a world-class marketing industry. We have a world-class financial industry, although perhaps that will change. And of course, the European Union, which we've already just mentioned briefly. The European Union has made it easier for people to travel from an EU country and migrate to places like the UK for work. That's because they don't require a visa, they don't require a separate permit to be able to do that. An interesting story in the news on this week. UK farmers are hiring planes to bring Bulgarian and Romanian farm workers over to the UK to prevent the crops that we have rotting in the field. So an interesting story, especially as in the current circumstances with the coronavirus raging, our migration systems, our transports, international transport systems, flights and trains and transport across borders have really slowed almost right down to nothing. Okay, so thinking about those things that we've just discussed, I would like you to do the task. I would like you to decide which of the causes under the birth rate you think contributes most to the UK's population growth and justify that, explain to me why. And of course, which under the migration heading you think contributes most to the UK's population growth and why. Pause the video to give yourself some time to do the task. Off you go. Okay, so international migration to the UK has a long history, and it's one that many of us at Preston Manor School are a part of, including myself. Now, I would like you to start off with that short video there. It's just a very brief cartoon by the University of Kent. So start off with that for me, please, and then we'll just have a think about the rest. So in the 1950s, now obviously migration, as the video demonstrated, started a long time before the 1950s, but if we're thinking about modern, quite recent migration that will have a significant influence on today's population of the UK, who do we see, what cultures, backgrounds do we meet in the UK? A lot of this sort of really is founded in the 1950s. So post-war, the UK had a real shortage of workers. And so the UK government encouraged immigration from the Caribbean, from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Now, take a quick moment. What do all those places have in common? Why would the UK have gone to those places to find people to come to the UK? Why didn't they go to Turkey, for instance? Okay, why didn't they go and ask Russians to come here? What was the difference? And hopefully many of you have guessed, of course, that is because these are Commonwealth countries. They are formerly part of the British Empire. And so even in the 1950s, okay, the UK had a huge amount of control. The British Empire was not over in the 1950s. It may have been in steep decline, okay, but the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, most of those were not independent at this point, okay? They were not fully independent. They were still part of the Commonwealth. And so they became sources of labour and people who would migrate to the UK and fill those gaps in works. Okay, so by 1971, over 1 million people had moved to the UK. Most of the people that moved were young adults with children, or they were single men. Now, being young adults, okay, meant that they were ready to get into work. They already had their education. They'd been selected back in the countries where they came from by the British government to give them permission. Okay, and just here there's a video which is a young man from the Caribbean, or he's an old man now, but when he was young he migrated to the UK. And it's his sort of story and experience of migration to the UK. It's something perhaps that as young people in the UK today we don't sort of experience as much, that sort of outright racism, the discrimination and the difficulty of it. Perhaps your parents or your grandparents, they recall that, they remember that, they, you have heard of it a lot, but it's always good to hear it again, okay? Now, between 1972 and 1980, there was much less of a shortage of labour, and the government really put a lot of controls and restrictions on the number of people who were allowed to arrive in the UK. Now, as we've seen in recent years, what happened back then was there was quite a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, okay? People talking about the fact that they wanted migration to stop, that it was bad for the economy or it was bad for people's jobs, okay? And this is something that we can discuss further in later lessons, okay? But having an understanding of the way public perception influences government policy, always important. In 2004, economic growth and enlargement of the EU creates a new wave of migration. So we've had this sort of 1950s to 1970s wave of migration, and much of that is from the Commonwealth. This new wave of migration in the 2000s then is mostly European migrants, okay? And this is because there's a number of countries, 7 countries or 8 countries, who have joined the European Union and have had to wait a few years for their permission for their population to be allowed to move about Europe. Okay, so this promise that Europe brings a free movement of people had some restrictions on it, and it was loosened in 2004, and it allowed migrants from Poland, Latvia and Estonia, Romania and Bulgaria as well, to arrive in the UK. We still rely on many of those migrants, and some of the concerns around Brexit are particularly around whether or not we will have shortages of labour as a result of restrictions on the movement of people from those same European countries. In 2012-2015, we have a new wave of migration to the UK, not necessarily one that we have nothing to do with either. Large civil wars and increases in the amount of fighting in Syria and in Afghanistan as a result of sort of US-led and Taliban insurgencies lead to a huge number of refugees being generated, and some of those refugees end up seeking refuge in the UK. Not huge numbers of them, okay? Very, very small percentages of those refugees end up in the UK, but for us here in the UK, it becomes a noticeable wave of people arriving. And in 2014, okay, about 500,000 immigrants arrived, and but 317,000 people emigrated out of the UK. So what we can see here, and it's maybe less clear from my timeline overall, but what we should be able to see here is that every year many people leave the UK. Okay, many people arrive, and at the moment the balance is more immigrants than emigrants. Okay, more people coming in than leaving, and this contributes to the growth of the UK population. So our next task is thinking about some of the impacts. And in particular, these impacts do centre in our urban cores, as we discussed last lesson. So London has the world's second largest urban immigrant population, with 37% of its population born outside of the UK. In Brent, that number is even higher. It's over 50% of Brent's population is born outside of the UK. So, really, really strong history of migration, but also a strong continuing trend of migration. The people here right now, 37% of them in London were not born inside the UK, okay? And that's much, much larger than the percentages across the whole of the UK. So it's quite different in different places. What I want you to do is, again, in your worksheet, so you should have done questions 1 and 2, typed up those. I would like you please to go through each of this list of impacts of immigration and colour code them as social or economic. For a challenge, I'd like you to give some examples about some of these statements, okay, and to add in this space at the bottom here, 2 of your own statements for impacts of migration on the UK. Off you go. Right, if you have categorized your impacts, I would like you now to rank them. Ranking them means putting them in order of what you think the most positive and negative things are, okay? So you're going to need to use 2 colors for your ranking, okay? So rank number 1 on the positive items and rank number 1 on the negative items are obviously the 2 most extreme things. So the best thing, the most positive impact is going to be rank number 1 positive, and then rank number 1 negative, okay? Is the worst thing absolutely awful, okay? And then justify, give me a reason why you chose those things to be the best and the worst. Okay, so using Caboodle, okay, we talked about this last lesson. You need to go and log on to Caboodle. Here's your little instruction again. Our institution code is J01. You use your email address, okay, to log in with, and your password can be easily reset by using your email address. I'd like you to go to page 164 and 165. Please do read those pages before you do this task, and once you've read those pages, I'd like you to answer just questions 4 and 5. Here are the figures that you're going to need. So figure 3 is 2 population pyramids for the UK as a whole, okay? This one down here is 171, no, 171, what I'm saying, sorry, is 1971, and this one that you're comparing it to is 2015, okay? So with that lovely big gap between those time periods, what you should notice is that people that were young in 1971 should be now quite a bit older in 2015. So this bulge here has gone up here. This bulge here is this one here. Why it's smaller is because, of course, as people age, they're more likely to die. And at the very end of this PowerPoint, along with your homework, I have an interesting article about where all our missing 90-year-olds are. Okay, as well as obviously current impact on the elderly population of our coronavirus crisis might be much more significant and will actually again alter this population pyramid that we're looking at here. Okay, so those 2 questions for me, please. Explaining what the effects of an aging population are on the future distribution of the UK's population. Where do older people maybe want to live? Where would they like to live, okay? And what might that do to the UK's population densities? And those questions, you are answering them down here in your worksheet, okay? So the final thing today, dirting your answers, sorry. Please do correct your answers once you're done with those. Final thing today, the exam style question, okay? So here we go. Figure 1 is the UK's increasing population over time. Okay, the population here is in millions. It's obviously not 56 people. I would like you to explain the increase in the UK's population shown here. 4 marks requires 2 points with development, okay? You need to make your points really, really clear. Give examples, give reasons that we have already discussed for why the UK's population has grown. If you really need help with this, go back to the first 2 tasks, thinking about why the UK's population has grown over time. Okay, guys, that is the end of our lesson. Green penning your answers, please, and making sure that you have done your homework for next lesson. So this is the article I mentioned. Okay, really interesting piece of further reading there. Okay, and doing your homework, it's the Northeast Old Economy and Southeast New Economy case study cards that were in your homework packs. Okay, that is due next lesson, which for some of you is Friday. Okay, and for others of you, maybe sooner. Okay, bye-bye.